They were asked, both of them really, about the coal, the change of wording in coal. And we heard the British Prime Minister saying he didn't think there was that much difference between phasing down and phasing out. Alok Sharma, clearly also, though, disappointed and saying that there was a time when he thought the deal really was in jeopardy for about an hour.
That's right. And I think, one of the journalists asked whether, why he let the Indians, so-called get away with it. And actually, there's a broader package here to protect. And it is important to remember that this is a historic mention for fossil fuels in these cover agreements. And so it's part of that broader package that brings countries back around the table every year, has these checkpoints to make sure that they do reduce their emissions. But something that actually wasn't addressed very clearly in the press conference, maybe because no journalist actually asked, was what's going to happen in this next year? The UK holds the presidency for an entire year. It actually only gains the presidency on the first day of the climate summit. And there's a lot of work to be done on three areas. The first area being actually making sure that all the pledges that were made around the formal negotiations are actually transformed and converted into the plans and policies of nations across the world who made historic commitments. Vietnam, for example, the third biggest pipeline of coal in that country, committed to actually not building any more new coal within this next year. I mean, that's huge. If that gets implemented in their national plans, that will make a significant dent in this emissions gap that we've been talking about. But secondly, there's a huge amount of work to be done, and the Prime Minister did allude to this, around the finance, making sure that not only, a bit of climate finance here and there goes to developing countries, but that the entire financial system, public and private, shifts towards clean, green energy production, transport, home heating, rather than supporting and subsidising the fossil fuels that have actually caused this problem.
And just on the whole coal question, is there basically a discrepancy between Alok Sharma saying he thought the whole deal was in jeopardy and he was determined to keep the word coal in, and for an hour he said that he'd been asked repeatedly, do you feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, and for a very tense hour he really did feel that, and the Prime Minister saying that actually there's not so much in it between those two phrases?
Well, the phrases that they were talking about were the phase out and the phase down, but the coal mention was in each of those iterations. So I don't think there's much of a disagreement. I think Alok Sharma was very keen to keep the mention of coal on the face of the cover agreement.
And in terms of, as you said, the island nations, the Prime Minister said that he felt that they were the stars, in a way, of the whole COP summit, because we heard them obviously give these very visceral, emotional pleas for help. And the Prime Minister admitting that they hadn't got all the way there, but that, they'd at least given themselves the tools to go on the journey, repeating that, of course, everyone's going to be called back next year. And he gave the summit just over 6, or more than 6 out of 10 for success. Do you think that is something that people generally will agree with, or are we never going to get that sort of consensus?
I don't think you'll ever get the consensus. And what's really interesting here is that people who really want climate action, some really, Greta Thunbergs of this world, who are clearly very passionate about this, are calling the COP a failure. And then yet you also have organisations and individuals who actually want to delay climate action, also calling it a failure. So there's a strange, odd synergy between these two opposing groups, and you're never going to get everyone to agree. And what people need to remember is that these summits are an important part of addressing climate change, but they're not the only part of addressing climate change. The real economy is moving. People, the social feeling about this, the feeling amongst people all across the world, in this country, in the UK, and across the world, climate change and the environment is now one of the top concerns for the public. And that pressure has been making an impact on the politics, which is why we're now seeing these climate summits moving faster. So it's all linked, it's all integrated, and one thing pushes another, and hopefully we will get that acceleration over this critical decade to have the emissions that we need to keep 1.5 alive.
Alok Sharma was asked, of course, it's been noticed that he was emotional towards the end of the summit yesterday, and he said he was emotional. He said that was for a range of reasons, partly because there was so much relief that he'd actually got this deal over the line. He said he'd had 6 hours sleep in 3 days. And both he and the Prime Minister were also praising the actions of India, because we've heard obviously criticism of India and China, but they were also praising the actions of the government there.
That's right. India actually in the first week came out with a surprise pledge for net zero, to reach net zero by 2070. Now, that might seem late to commentators who are not familiar with the climate world and the historical emissions that have been released by the developed world. But 2070 net zero target for India is actually really impressive, and is in line with the Paris Agreement and in line with the science in order to keep 1.5 alive. But not only that, and Alok Sharma alluded to this in his statement just there, actually the Indians are looking to get 50% of their electricity generation from renewables by 2030. I mean, that means that pretty much almost every single new plant that they'll be building will have to be renewables in order to meet that target. So very, very interesting, very impressive pledge that was made by the Indians. And, you know, it could be said that it actually really helped put pressure on the Chinese to try to get them eventually, hopefully in the next year or so, to move faster too.
We will leave it there. Sepi, thank you so much for your time and for giving us your analysis of what we have heard in the last 45 minutes or